As Africa accelerates its journey towards deeper economic integration, the Intra-African Trade Fair stands as a flagship platform for turning the vision of AfCFTA into a reality. At the forefront of this success is Mrs. Kanayo Awani, Executive Vice President of Afreximbank, whose leadership has been instrumental in championing trade finance, supporting SMEs, and unlocking opportunities across the continent. As IATF 2025 concludes, she reflects on how this unique platform can accelerate Africa's industrialization, strengthen intra-African trade, and drive inclusive growth for the continent's 1.4 billion people. Mrs. Kanayo, welcome to Africa 24.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
First things first, we would like to find out for people that do not know about IATF, or what is it all about, the Intra-African Trade Fair?
Well, the Afreximbank introduced Intra-African Trade Fair, which had its inaugural version at Egypt in 2018. At that time, we just introduced our Intra-African trade strategy. It was clear to us that the intra-African trade that was as stubbornly at about 15% at the time will not grow any further by just financing alone unless you dealt with the issues of facilitation and the hindrances to intra-African trade. We identified earlier on. And while people may say infrastructure as the biggest hindrance, we thought that the lack of access to trade and market information was probably the biggest hindrance or biggest inhibition. Why do we say that? The infrastructure as is today carries extra-African trade at 85%. We needed to break the barriers of lack of access to trade and market information. Our historical and colonial past skewed trade outwards rather than inwards, such that Africans don't know what their neighbors are producing. They don't know where their neighbors, the markets that their neighbors have. They don't even know the partnerships to forge. And that's why we thought that if we're going to break the barrier of lack of access to trade and market information, we need to do something about it. And that's what the Intra-African Trade Fair is all about. You come into a platform, and it's a virtual and a physical platform where you see buyers, sellers, and we facilitate with matchmaking buyers and sellers, matchmaking investors to investment opportunities, forging partnerships, forging feeder groups that feed off the intra-African trade champions. It has become the biggest platform for policy and private conversations. So we can dialogue together to see regulations that are best for intra-African trade and for the implementation of the AfCFTA. And a gathering like this, that gathers tens of thousands of people from the Africa and beyond, it's energized to be able to support the ambitions we had in growing intra-African trade. And in fact, if you saw the report that was produced over the last few editions that was launched at this venue, you will notice that even between 2023 and 2024, right, they went based on the cycles of intra-African trade we've had. Intra-African trade has been said by at least Afreximbank to grow by over 7%.
That said, since we are participating at the 4th edition of this IATF, could you share with us some of the positive outcomes that have come out of this?
The positive outcomes that have come out of it is that we are well on track to meet the key performance indicators that we set for ourselves. It's not just an event, and it's not an end in itself. It's the fact that we're closing deals, that investments are happening, that partnerships are being forged from across the borders, and that, by the way, I would post it, that 80% or 90% of visitors who have come here have come to Algeria for the first time. That in itself is a testimony.
During the IATF, we also talk a lot about creative industries that are bring forth by the CANICs. So why does it have to do with trade, investment, deals? What do we have to talk about creative industries here?
No, creative industries has a lot to do with trade and investments. Aside from the fact that it's part of trade and services, trade is not just about goods. It's also about services. It's also about intangibles. It is part of our Intra-African Trade Strategy to support the creative industry along several verticals. You may know that we support film, music, fashion, arts and crafts, sports, gastronomy, literature. And there's trade going on in those. People are consuming African films across Africa. People are listening to African music. People are exchanging trade in our goods and services. We decided, as part of that strategy of our creative, what we call CANEX, which is the name we've used to sum up our creative strategy and are implementing it, is that we cannot ignore Africa's youth. We can't ignore Africa's young people. Africa has a burgeoning youth population, but it's not just about the demographics of our young people. It is also the abundance of talents. Some of them have their talents and intellectual property rights being exploited in the same way you'll exploit minerals and mining assets, right, are being exploited. And that's why we've introduced several elements to see how we can promote the transformation of that sector and commercialize it meaningfully so that Africa's young people, the talented people around us, monetize those talents and make it a real source of livelihood. So I think that's one of the things, that's our mission. When we developed the strategy of the CANEX, we were looking at solving some important problems. You know, remember I talked earlier on about trade facilitation. Sometimes it's not only financing a lot. You have to look at the other things that are inhibiting the growth of that sector. Why that sector? It is over $2 trillion in trade in goods and services, right? And Africa is still at the periphery. It's the fact that our young people don't have market access. They don't know how to access markets. But this provides a platform for buyers, for investors, to come here. And if you go through the creative venue, you will see all sorts of things going on in music, film, short films, publishing, and a whole lot of things, even in sports, to engage in exchange ideas, exchange deals, exchange investments. So aside from market access as well, we're also doing masterclasses because we also recognize that we have to build capacity in the sector. You will agree with me also that there's a lot of gaps in the skill sets, even in businesses. So a host of masterclasses are going across the verticals, and finally, intellectual property. Weak institutions on the continent. The part of the reason we're supporting the sector is such that we can help strengthen institutions. In my opening speech on the creatives, I talked about Yvonne Chaka Chaka, who at the age of 19, sang that famous Mbompoti song, right? She herself told me, that she wasn't even interested in money at 19. She was interested in the fame. I guess she got the fame, but her intellectual property, she didn't focus on that. And the rest is history. So what we're trying to do, in fact, we have a company we call the Kindness Ratios Incorporated, whose mission is to house Africa's intellectual property to stem it from exploitation. That's why we're here. That's why we showcase the Kindness, because we believe in its transformational power as far as Africa is concerned.
So when you did say it, and you even emphasize on it, IATF is not just an event, it is a trading platform. Now, could you say a word about its legacy? What is IATF's legacy today?
IATF is about, the short sentence, it's about Africa taking its destiny in its hands.
Ladies and gents, this takes us to the end of this interview. Thank you for watching it, and please stay tuned for more on Africa24tv.com and on the app My Africa 24.